North Idaho College and today's broadcast of the North Idaho College Public Forum. The crew is comprised of North Idaho College television students. Your moderator is North Idaho College political scientist Tony Stewart.
Today we have the opportunity to talk about the United Nations and its role in society as that relates to world problems and world issues. In order to deal with that subject, I have a very special honor today to welcome to our program Ambassador Davidson Hepburn. He is the ambassador from the Bahamas to the United Nations. Mr. Ambassador, it's a pleasure to have you on our program, and we know you have a busy schedule today, and you were kind to take time out to be with us on this program and to discuss what I believe is an incredibly important subject, and we thank you very much.
Thank you. I'm very pleased to be here.
What I'd like to do during the 30 minutes that we have together, I would like to discuss several aspects of the United Nations as you fit into that organization and the role, so that our viewers at the end of the program would have what I would believe would be a very fine understanding of different aspects from an expert such as yourself. I believe, first of all, that the role of each ambassador to the United Nations from various countries is not identically the same. It depends on the size of the country and so forth. In addition to being the ambassador from the Bahamas, I believe you have some other duties that, for example, the United States ambassador would not have. Would you explain your, what might say, job description for our viewers?
My job description is one that I think would be likened to that of an administrator. Beside doing the work in the international community, I must supervise the work in the office. Sometimes in the early stages of my career, I had to do my own typing. It was a situation where we couldn't get people who would be willing to work for the salaries that we could pay. I have to oversee the work of my officers. Sometimes I have to do my own research. I prepare my own speeches. And I'm not complaining. I enjoy doing this kind of thing. But I'm looking forward to the day when I could really deal with only matters of state, so to speak. I'm sure that I would be quite bored. But I would like that kind of change, because right now I'm extremely busy with all of the administrative work, plus dealing with the heavy load at the UN.
And well, in addition to the UN work and administrative work, I believe that you represent your country or the people from your area, and even as it relates to the consul work and so forth. Is that correct?
Yes. I think there are people who are not able to differentiate between the mission and the consulate. And we get questions all the time about visas to the Bahamas and what they have to do, and is it possible to buy houses and land and all of these. And rather than referring them to the consulate, I I normally answer the questions, because I worked as Director of Immigration for a number of years in the Bahamas before going to the United Nations.
One final thing about your own personal career, and then we'll get into the aspects of the United Nations. Very recently, you were a candidate for a very honored position in the United Nations, President of the General Assembly, and you were, I might add, a very strong candidate. I believe you lost only by 6 votes out of the entire delegation. Would you like to share that experience with us?
It was a very good experience. It was painful, I think, in the end. I wanted to be the President of the General Assembly because I had some new ideas I would like to put forward. But I was heartened by the support that I got from many of my colleagues and from persons in the Secretariat who felt that if I did win, I would have done a very good job. But I think the point that was most refreshing for me was telling my son, he's 7 years of age, before that I was going to be a candidate and I had to work, and I'd let him know the results. When I came home and told him, he said to me, "Well, you always taught me that winning isn't everything, and frankly I'm glad that you lost, because now you can spend more time with me." It heartened me to know that he felt that way, and this is true of diplomats. They have very little time to spend with their families, and sometimes it's very difficult to have a very good relationship.
Let us get into some of the discussion of the United Nations. And again, I'm sure many of the viewers have a very vague concept of what an ambassador does. So could you give us some of those statistics? First of all, how many countries are there at the United Nations? How many ambassadors? And what is the basic role of an ambassador in representing their country?
At the moment, there are 158 member states at the United Nations. The majority of these states became members in the 60s. Before that time, there were only 51 members in the United Nations. At that time, it was run almost like an elite country club. With the addition of so many members from developing countries, the whole concept of the United Nations began to change, because persons who came from developing countries had very little expertise. They did not know a great deal about international relations. Many of them had never gone there as an observer before, and this was very difficult to fit into the scheme of the United Nations system. Presently, there are some countries without ambassadors. For example, Saudi Arabia, for many, many years, did not have an ambassador. They always had a deputy ambassador. This year, there is one. Many of the smaller countries opted for membership, but would only send someone during the General Assembly session. They would not have a permanent mission at the United Nations. Slowly but surely, many of the countries are recognizing that this is the way to conduct international relations, and beginning to send their members to the United Nations more often. From my region, and it's rather a sub-region, first I should say the UN is divided into 5 regional groups: the African, the Asian, the Latin American, the Eastern European, and the Western European. The Bahamas falls in the category of the Latin American group. However, we have what is called a subgroup of the Caribbean, and many of the countries of the Caribbean became members very recently, and some of them are unable to send anyone to the United Nations. So we work together as a group, trying to help where we can, not only in terms of office space, but also giving information from the various committees that we have. I don't want to draw this out much longer, but there is so much to tell about the setup of the United Nations before you can get into that. And one aspect is there are 7 committees. Now, you have to understand that when you have a country like mine, for example, we have only 3 offices in the mission, and there are 7 committees, the first, the second, the third, the special political, the 5th, the 6th, and the legal committee. And then you have the General Assembly. So we are all running around like chickens with their heads cut off, trying to understand what's going on in the various committees. So what we do among smaller states, we share. If I'm unable to attend a committee, I have somebody there from another country who's attending, and I can get the information from him or her, and I can understand what is going on. Where we have special interests, we try to follow those much more closely. But on the overall scale, when you have countries like the United States, China, the Soviet Union, the United Kingdom, who would have about 4 or 5 persons in one committee to deal with one single item, it's a very difficult task for a very small country.
Right. In relation to the organization, as you've indicated, you have the General Assembly with all the countries having membership there, and you have these 7 committees that operate out of the Assembly, is that correct?
Yes.
And then you have the National Security Council.
Yes.
I think that it would be helpful to the viewers if you would give us some idea of the role of the National Security Council and the role of the Assembly, when they meet and what their duties are.
The Security Council meets whenever there is a need. Regretfully, I must say that every day there is a need for the Security Council to meet. The General Assembly meets each year from the 2nd Tuesday in September to the end of December. In those 3 months, we deal with something like 154 items. These items are allocated to the various committees that I just mentioned. There is a general committee that deals with these items and decides whether or not the item should be allocated to one or other of the committee. If the Security Council meets on the question of Lebanon, for example, or the question of Nicaragua, and the vote is, the resolution rather, is vetoed by one of the 5 permanent members of the United Nations, this is then brought to the General Assembly, if that country so decides, as a special emergency session, to have the general vote in the General Assembly, because there is a stronger feeling that if the item is dealt with in the General Assembly and the vote in favor is very large, then the other countries might take note. However, this has not been working. There are questions like Nicaragua, Namibia, Lebanon, Cyprus, which is now at the moment being dealt with in the Security Council. And I don't personally see how the General Assembly is going to bring about any solution by voting for these resolutions and bringing them back again to the General Assembly. I think they must be solved in the Security Council, and we're doing a number of things now to try to bring to bear on the members of the Security Council, the permanent members, who are France, the United Kingdom, the Soviet Union, China, and these countries must be willing to not veto some of the resolutions that are brought forward, because when it's vetoed, then it's dead. There is no way you can deal with it anymore.
We make a point to the viewers that those are the permanent members of the Security Council. Any one of those can veto any item.
Yes.
They have absolute veto.
Yes.
In addition to those members that you have mentioned, how many additional members rotate?
10. There are 10. There are 15 members on the Security Council, and it's very interesting to point out here that 2 years ago, maybe more than that, there was a resolution to increase the number of members on the Security Council, because since the developing countries have such a large majority in the United Nations system, there are member states who feel that not only those 5 should not only be the ones to have the veto power, but it should be granted to every member on the Security Council, or the Security Council should be larger so that the views of many developing countries could be heard. This did not meet with a great deal of favor in the United Nations system, and not only the permanent members were opposed to this, and I think one of the main reasons given is that with 15 members, it's quite unwieldy to operate the Security Council, and to have more members there might create a greater problem. Of course, you can argue these until the end of time, but I personally feel, with my experience, that smaller bodies should be more effective. It doesn't always prove. But I think to have more members on the Security Council might not be a very good way of settling problems. But with the way the situation is going now, I think that many member states may change their position and agree to an enlargement of the members of the Security Council. That is the non-permanent members.
When the National Security Council meets on an emergency and they take an action, and suppose there's not a veto, if at the same time the Assembly is there or is about to meet and does meet, can the Assembly overrule the decision of the Council?
No, I don't think it's a matter of overruling. It's merely a matter of getting public opinion. With the hope that when it goes back to the Security Council, the weight of the vote in the General Assembly might help to change the positions of many of the member states of the Security Council. Two of those we've had. One was on the question of Nicaragua, and one was on the question of Namibia, and they were both overwhelmingly supported within the General Assembly. I think some change has taken place on the question of Namibia, but as far as Nicaragua is concerned, I think it's still a status quo.
In relation to this issue of the United Nations and the issues that come before it, we hear a lot of praise and a lot of criticism of the way the United Nations operates and how effective or ineffective it might be in the world. I would love to give you this opportunity as an ambassador and a member of that organization to indicate, one, do you think the United Nations has been important and successful in some major issues in the last 15 or 20 years? And if so, would you like to discuss how you believe that might have helped among nation states of the world?
I can say very simply, and I think I'm biased in terms of the United Nations, I feel that it's a very good organization. It serves a purpose. The difficulty is that member states within the United Nations system are not willing to share, and by this I mean each member state has its own personal feelings and views about the United Nations, and each member state probably feels that it's there to defend its national interest. I don't think anyone can disagree with that. But I see the United Nations as an interdependent force that if something happens to the United States, it affects the Bahamas and vice versa. If something happens in Cyprus, it affects what's happening in Mali and vice versa. But when it comes down to deciding how we're going to deal with this question, then member states have their own personal reasons as to why they can't agree, like the new international economic order, the global round as it's called. The economic situation in the world is so very bad, and everybody's talking about a change. It has to be changed if anything is to be done. Yet there are countries who feel that they could not go along with some of the views that are being presented. I agree that the developing countries under the aegis of the non-aligned countries, and probably I can explain a little more about that later on, might ask for outrageous things to happen. But I think the situation is such that it has to be done that way, because when you go on in the calm manner that has been taking place for the last 20 years, there is no recognition. Nobody stands up and take note. I'm sorry to say that that is the way we have to do things, but people like to be pushed against the wall before they make any decisions. It's a very bad position to have. But I think this is why many developing countries are so adamant about what they would like to see in this whole question. Now, I think that what has to be done is that the developing countries will have to give up some of their selfish views, and the developed countries would have to give up some of theirs. The one word or jargon that has come in the United Nations in the past years is political will. It's a marvelous expression, a good word, but when it comes down to implementing political will, nobody wants to do it. And I think this is the difficulty with the United Nations system. And I feel that the enforcement of the principles of the Charter have not been put into effect, and they should be implemented within the Security Council itself. Last year we had a resolution, and I'm on the committee to deal with the implementation of security within the world. And the developing countries were quite opposed to this resolution, and right now many of them are refusing to join the committee to talk about some of the problems. But we're going to go ahead with it to see if we can come up with some guidelines as to how some changes might be made, because it's absolutely necessary. Now, the United Nations is never going to be better than it is unless we have this feeling of a desire not to fight each other. And I don't mean that in literal terms, I could. But there is a power struggle within the United Nations, and there are countries who take sides. And as long as we continue to do this, we're not going to be successful in what we do. But I sincerely hope that the general public within the United States and elsewhere could recognize that the United Nations is important and would continue to support that, because when the general public begins to talk about the United Nations as being ineffective and as being non-existent, then it creates some problems within the body itself, and I think we need to work on that angle as well.
Mr. Ambassador, there are a lot of issues that we could deal with in very specific terms, and I know we won't have time for all of them, but I would like to start with some economic, social problems of the world. You have referred to, of course, the great dialogue or debate that takes place in the United Nations between the developed and the developing countries as it relates to economic matters. We hear from various reports that there are some very fragile economic conditions in the world today, that it has to do, even among the developed countries, in trade and balance of payment deficits. Europe and what it's doing, what the United States is doing, what's happening in Japan and other places. We also see at the same time that the developing countries are indicating a greater need for better prices for their raw materials and so forth, and more capital for development in their own countries, in education, transportation, and other matters. This is such a general, broad question, but how do you see this evolving? Are we headed for some very serious economic crisis? And if so, what are some of the things that both the developing and the developed countries need to do to try to prevent really economic crisis that could be serious?
I think there is the general view that there is an economic crisis in the world. I think the difficulty is sometimes when we look at how people live maybe in the United States and many other developed countries rather, and in some developing countries, we tend to lose sight of the great need for some kind of balance in terms of the economic development. There are a number of countries that are in great debt, and when I hear the numbers, the figures, I can only understand $100. I can't understand beyond that. And people talk in the billions of dollars. And in order to do this, they're talking about a kind of equitable share of the resources. For example, we're dealing now with transnational corporations. And one of the questions is that if there are going to be transnational corporations in countries where there are natural resources, there must be some way that the country can benefit from what is being taken out of the country, as well as the transnational corporation. At the moment, nobody is sure whether the transnational corporation is doing everything and getting all of the benefits and the country itself is losing. But I do know that in many of these countries, the trade is very poor. The rate of exchange that they would get on their natural resources like copper, tin, bauxite, and a number of these others are not enough to help to change the kinds of difficulties that they're having. So I think what we need to do is to look at the whole question of protectionism, which is something that is being developed over and over again now in developed countries, and see whether that cannot be broken down so that these countries that have natural resources can gain from them. In countries such as mine, where we have no natural resources and we depend a great deal on tourism, we depend a great deal on laws of banking, we depend a great deal on the sea. We support the Treaty of the Law of the Sea because we know that sometime, sooner or later, there is going to be some exploitation in the sea, and we need to know how we can benefit from that. We need to protect our feelings on tourism. We need to protect our feelings with respect to banking, and we have some difficulties there with countries that feel that we ought not to have a tax haven or whatever you want to call it. So these are all problems that I think we need to sit down together and discuss them on an international plane and see whether or not the Bahamas, for example, could give up some of its feelings about certain things, and the other countries can do the same. In this way, we can have a better chance to share the benefits that we get from the sea, from the land, and from elsewhere.
Is there any significant evidence in the United Nations today that there is some significant progress being made on the economic front, or is it still just in discussion?
I don't think so. I think it's stalemated at this time. There are 3 talks going on now. Global negotiations is the name that we're using now, but UNCTAD, this is the trade on conferences, has not reached an agreement whereby some of the developed countries could accept the kind of plan that is being put forward by developing countries. And I don't see any progress, really, in terms of negotiations. We're going to continue to talk, and I think that's a good thing, but I'm somewhat disappointed that we can't reach a solution on some of the issues.
Another area where the United Nations would be very concerned, of course I know that the nations involved would be the critical negotiators, and that has to do with the whole question of the nuclear age in which we live and the arms race. What is happening as you observe that from discussions at the United Nations in the arms talks? Is it as stalemated as the economic question, or do you see any positive signs on the horizon that there might be significant success in the arms negotiations?
I think more so. I think it's more stalemated in the question of disarmament or the arms race. You're touching on a very favorite topic of mine. I work with the Disarmament Committee, and I served as chairman of the committee for 1 year, and I work on a number of the committees with this. The greatest difficulty I see is this power struggle that I talked with you about earlier. The United States and the Soviet Union have come up with proposals that sound very good, but when it comes down to the question of agreeing to a way to solve this, then they go off on a tangent. The question of no first strike, for example, banning all nuclear weapons in the outer space, not building up your arsenals, and getting rid of many of the weapons of mass destruction and so on, chemical weapons, as you probably read of the very horrible situation in Iran and Iraq. Even though we understand that chemical weapons were used, no one can determine whether it was used by Iran or Iraq. So we come out with a great deal of verbiage on all of this, saying, yes, of course this is bad, but how do we stop it? And I think it's a very simple, maybe I shouldn't use that word, but it's a very simple way of stopping it. If we feel, as everybody is saying, that the world is going to be destroyed by any use of a nuclear weapon, why is it that we keep on building them? I think we ought to stop. And the first committee that deals with this can only come up with resolutions after resolutions, banning this and banning that, and they're always adopted by an overwhelming majority, and yet no one is willing to take a stand among the major powers to say, yes, of course, we are going to stop doing what we're doing. This poses a problem because the developing countries are afraid. Some of them say, well, my country borders with country X, and it's very difficult for us not to have an arsenal because we don't know when we're going to be attacked. There's a great deal of fear in the minds of many people, and when our countries are spending their money to buy arms, they could have used it to buy food, to buy health facilities, to create better educational facilities. But you can't talk about these things to power-hungry people who are merely interested in who's going to be the greatest. And this is not only true of the developed countries, it's true of developing countries. There is a fight going on in every region of the world to see who is going to be the major factor in the region. In Asia, in Africa, in Latin America, it's very much the same. And I'm convinced that unless we agree and seriously agree that the world is going to be destroyed by all of this, we're not going to do anything about it. I think many heads of state say that having this buildup of arms is more of a security than anything else, and I think that's a very frightening kind of thought. I feel that if you don't have it, you're not going to use it, and if you have it and you're tempted, you're going to use it, and I think we need to look at it from that point of view. But it's a very much more serious problem, I think, than the economic situation.
But it sounds from the information that you're giving us that there's just such tremendous problems on both fronts, and that we're just not making great progress in the world at this time. We're just about out of time, and I just don't want the program to end without getting your view, however, on the Middle East. The last few years we've seen such transition taking place in leaders and in issues. We've seen positive signs at times that Israel and Egypt particularly are able to reach some accords or agreements, and that maybe there's a little sign of stability. And then we have the breakouts we had in Lebanon and so forth. What do you hear at the United Nations about what might happen in the next few years in the Middle East?
Not very good news. Last Tuesday I came back from the Middle East, and I had a chance to visit Jordan, Israel, and to talk with a few people in the area about what's happening. It doesn't seem to me that there is going to be any early solution. I think the feeling of hate is so strong, it's so deep, that I'm afraid that unless we know how to erase that, we're not going to do very much. Lebanon is completely destroyed, and I think it's going to take a great deal to bring it back. Iran-Iraq is another very crazy situation. And in Israel itself, there are problems on the West Bank, and even though I think the negotiations by Egypt and Israel have been a very good thing, now there is a falling away from that, which is going to put us back into very difficult straits.
I'm so sorry to interrupt. I wish we had more time.
Certainly.
We just touched the surface on all these subjects, but you've been so kind to come and to share your very sober thoughts with us, and we appreciate that very much.
I thank you for having me here.
Ladies and gentlemen, our guest has been Ambassador Davidson Hepburn, who is the ambassador from the Bahamas to the United Nations. And as you can see, we have been discussing the economic problems of the world, the arms race, and we were able to touch on the Middle East. We hope you've enjoyed the program, and that you will give serious thought to the issues that we've discussed, and that you'll be with us again next week at this very same time. Please have a good week. I am Tony Stewart.
The North Idaho College Public Forum can be seen at this same time each week over this station. This production was videotaped earlier by a North Idaho College student crew for viewing at this more appropriate time.